Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this webinar. And we are going to get started. My name is Mutambara with the University of Johannesburg. We are discussing today, we are having a public lecture on the work of the future, and we are asking, where is this work going to come from? Our meeting is organized as follows. We are going to have opening remarks from Professor Marwala, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg. Then we have our main presentation from David Attar, who is the professor at MIT. Then we have our discussant, Professor Pragna Rognana, who is head of sociology at the University of Johannesburg. Then we want to make this more of a discussion. So we have audience participation by way of questions and comments. Then we have closing remarks from Fiona. Now, why are we having this discussion? In the AI-driven fourth industrial revolution, there's been a big area of discussion called the future of work, which has been popular in terms of research and public discourse. The future of work describes changes in how work will get done, influenced by technology, generational and social shifts. Although there are three aspects: generational shift, social shift, and technological shift, the major driver is technology. And the assumption in the future of work is that jobs are in trouble from machines and technology. Now, when we say work of the future, we're challenging this and saying the future of work is the wrong mindset. We must say work of the future, which is a better framework. Why are we saying this? We are saying technology is neither the problem nor the solution. If we are clever in the fourth industrial revolution, we can create more and better jobs and not less. We're saying high industrial productivity and strong labor markets can coexist. It does not necessarily have to be either or. How can we do this? We need to create robust systems and institutions. What are we saying? We must support workers through long cycles of technological disruption. And this requires the development of institutional innovations that complement technological change. How can we do this? This is the purpose of this public lecture. How we can carry out skilling, reskilling, so that our workers are productive even under the fourth industrial revolution. Hybrid training and learning for workers. The objective is to empower workers to become more productive, to remain productive in an endlessly disruptive workplace. Yes, the AI-driven fourth industrial revolution could mean more jobs and not less. Of course, there'll be differences between the global north and global south. What are those differences? That is the purpose of this seminar, to learn from Professor Attar from MIT. This is the basis of this lecture, which we're calling the work of the future. Where would the work come from? Before I call upon Professor David Attar to come and speak, I'm going to call upon our Vice Chancellor, a PhD from Cambridge in artificial intelligence, who is our champion at the University of Johannesburg in terms of the fourth industrial revolution. Professor Marwala, can you give us your opening remarks today as we carry out this public lecture? Professor Marwala.
Thank you very much, Professor Mutambara. I also would like to welcome Professor David Attar, as well as Professor Ruganan and Professor Trejena for joining us this afternoon. In 2021, Professor David Attar, alongside Professor David Mindel and Dr. Elizabeth Reynolds, wrote an intriguing piece for the MIT Technology Review, which began, and I quote, "A decade ago, powerful mobile phones were still a novelty. Driverless cars were never seen on public roadways, and computers did not listen to conversations or respond to spoken questions. The possibility of robots taking jobs seemed far off, save for an assembly line or two. But as the emerging capabilities of robotics and artificial intelligence began capturing headlines, and the popular imagination, researchers and commentators began warning that jobs long thought to be immune to automation, those demanding expertise, judgment, creativity, and seasoned experience, might soon be better accomplished by machines, close quote. We often talk of the paradigm shift, an abstract concept that signifies the coming of age and change. The origins of this phrase can be traced back to Thomas Kuhn. It is apparent that we are in the midst of this paradigm shift. And unlike what Professor Mutambara seemed to be suggesting, I don't think we quite know the trajectory of this shift and the impact it is going to have in the world of work. And part of the reason is because the technologies that are going to define this era are still being improved every day. In fact, if I were to use the famous phrases of modes of production, it is becoming clear that the fourth industrial revolution might as well be defined as a mode of production. The fourth industrial revolution, defined by the entrenchment of the digital technologies such as artificial intelligence, automation, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and communication technologies, alongside the parallel reality of the pandemic, has fundamentally redefined the world of work. As PwC outlined in its Workforce of the Future report, and I quote, this is not a time to sit back and wait for events to unfold. To be prepared for the future, you have to understand it, close quote. And there lies one of the crucial problems. Unfortunately, due to the limitation of the training as we see it, we have a great deal of economists who are not as well versed in technology, certainly as people who are working in technology. And we have people in the technological spaces who are not as well versed in the matters of economy and other social factors. And this mismatch actually results with a poor understanding of what exactly is this new mode of production in the fourth industrial age going to lead us? Where is it going to lead us? There is demonstrably consensus that there is a need for extensive discussions on how to address the ever-changing workforce and to explore the different pathways to close the gap. New innovations, prospects, and opportunities have emerged alongside the challenges of the pandemic, and together they present the possibility of a complex new era in human development, one where the race for digital and technological innovation must occur alongside arrest of ecological decline and expansion of social protections for those most at risk of redundancy, economic precarity, and impoverishment. And here I use the word digital technology. It might not even be digital technology. It might be quantum technology, as we are on the cusp of a revolution in quantum computing. While globally, countries have begun the process of recovery, unemployment remains a critical issue. So how do we reframe our conception of work in a future far different than one we have experienced in our lived history? Just over a decade ago, there was no need for social media managers, and staying in a job with the same company for your entire working life was actually a good thing. Now we have the TikTok regional managers, people to run our Twitter pages, a gig economy that has made multiple jobs commonplace and are redefining roles and moving on to something else, and quickly becoming the normal, the new normal, becoming the confluence of this complexity that is defining this era. This, I would argue, is just the beginning. It is apparent that there is a call for a skills revolution, if you will. According to the World Economic Forum Future of Jobs report, and I quote, "Developing and enhancing human skills and capabilities through education, learning, and meaningful work are key drivers of economic success, of individual well-being, and societal cohesion." And close quote. And as we think about skills, we have to bear in mind that we don't really know how the future of technology is actually going to look like, and what the impact of those technologies are actually going to be on the economy, society, and politics. Now, what is that education that we need to give to our students so that they will be able to grasp this future that we do not even understand? It is clear that we have to adapt to these changing circumstances by fundamentally reimagining human capacity and how we utilize it. Against this backdrop, I could not think of a more fitting speaker than Professor Attoh, an American economist and professor of economics at MIT, where he also acts as a co-director of the School Effectiveness and Inequality Initiative. Professor Attoh's extensive research and work speaks directly to the work of the future. In a lecture of his I recently watched, I was struck by his words, and I'm going to quote him again. "Part of where your work comes from is that as we make the world more complicated and interesting, we create new work for ourselves within it," close quote. Human adaptability, after all, is part and parcel of human nature and focuses on the flexibility with which humans, both as individuals and as populations, cope with environmental challenges through both biological and behavioral means. Our takeaway is that a changing world of work and a future that seems uncertain is not something to fear, but rather something to embrace. I look forward to hearing Professor Attoh's thoughts on this pertinent topic. As the futurist Hendrik von Schiele reminds us, it is people who are the centerpiece of the fourth industrial revolution. This is what we must continue to remember against an ever-changing context. I thank you, Ngiyabonga, Bayadanki.
Thank you very much, Professor Marwala, for those remarks. You have also adequately introduced Professor Attoh to us, who is the Vice President of the American Economic Association, co-director of the Labor Studies Program at MIT, the director of the Work of the Future Experimental Initiative at MIT. He has received many awards in the United States for his teaching and for his research. And he has been called the academic voice of the American worker because of his work. He has also been called somebody who has done transformation of our understanding of how globalization and technological change are impacting jobs and earning prospects for the American worker. He's an elected fellow of the Econometric Society and also the Society of Labor Economists and the American Academy of Arts and Science. Professor Attoh has a BA in psychology from Tufts University and a PhD in public policy from Harvard University. Professor David Attoh, the moment is yours. Tell us, what is the future of work? Where is the work of the future going to come from? I hand over to Professor David Attoh.
Thank you, Professor Mutambara, and thank you, Professor Marwala, for this inspiring introductions. I don't know if I can possibly do justice to the charge I've been given, but let me start by sharing my screen. So I'm going to speak about the work of the future. Where will it come from? Now, I want to make clear this is really a global North perspective, and needs to be translated, and that's part of the job of our conversation here. So I will say I actually do know something about South Africa. I actually was a volunteer for COSATU in 1992 and lived in Johannesburg for several months, as well as in Rondebosch briefly, and worked on skills training, computer skills training for COSATU affiliates. So I have some knowledge of your wonderful country, and I'm honored to be speaking to you today. So where will the work of the future come from? If you think about it, many people are concerned that automation is rendering human labor superfluous, and you can see where that idea would come from. A lot of the great innovations of the last 200 years were designed to replace labor. So the tractor was built to replace human and animal muscular power with internal combustion power. The assembly line was designed to replace artisanal human labor with repetitive motions done in a factory setting with greater precision and speed, but less expertise. The digital computer was designed to supplant cumbersome, error-prone human calculation and replace it with digital perfection. And these inventions have worked. In general, we don't any longer dig ditches by hand. We don't primarily pound tools out of wrought iron. We don't do bookkeeping using books. So we have displaced an enormous amount of human labor from these activities. Yet amazingly, in most industrialized countries, employment rates of adults have been rising over time. So in the US, the overall employment rate, the fraction of adults in the formal labor force, has risen for most of the last 125 years. Now, a lot of that reflects the movement of women out of constrictive, unpaid labor in the home into the formal labor market, where they can use their expertise, their skills, and their creativity. This picture would hold for most of the northern industrialized countries. It would not be a good description of South Africa, just to be clear. So there are really 4 questions I want to address today. First is, why are there still so many jobs in places that are the most technologically advanced countries, often the ones that have innovated in these technologies? And part of my answer is going to have to do with new work. And so my second question is, what is new work, and where does new work come from? Then the third point I want to address is how to think about the future. And one way to read my first set of remarks is that, we have work, so don't worry about it. And that is definitely not the point I'm making. There's a lot to worry about, but primarily it's not the number of jobs, but other attributes of work. And then finally, I want to close by talking about how we actually shape the future of work. Rather than thinking of the future as a fate to befall us, we should think about it as something that we are in the process of creating. So let me start with the first question. Why are there still so many jobs? So really, there are 3 answers I'm going to give you, and 2 of them I think will be familiar, and one of them will be less obviously so. The first reason is what I'm going to call insatiability. So to illustrate this, here's a picture of the complete household belongings of the Caven family of American Canyon, California in 1985. And they were kind enough to empty out their entire house for the sake of photographer Peter Menzel. And you can see in front of them, there's an enormous variety of belongings, bicycles, shelves full of books, toys, appliances, a car in the driveway, lamps, couches, television sets. And this would be a typical American family. And you can see that they have far, far in excess of what anyone would call necessity. And yet they would not consider themselves wealthy at that time. And if you were to do this exercise again, 40 years later, in 2022, there would be many, many more belongings in the picture. And so what this illustrates is that as societies get more productive and people get wealthier, their consumption rises pretty much one-to-one with incomes. And so people never consider themselves to be sufficiently wealthy or well off. They continue to spend. And so that insatiability intrinsically generates new demand for work. That as societies get wealthier, their demands for goods, for experiences, for services rises, and that creates new demand for labor. So part of the reason we don't run out of work is we create new work for one another as our affluence grows. But there's a second point to this. When many people think about technology and how it interacts with labor demand, they think primarily in terms of what gets automated, what is done by machines that used to be done by people. But in many cases, new technologies don't just replace us, they complement us. They make us better at what we do. So for example, if you are a medical doctor, you now have access to hundreds of diagnostic tests, blood tests and protein tests and oxygen tests and cell tests and so on to diagnose cancer, lung disorders, to look at balances of fat and proteins and so on. Now, many of these tests automate activities that were previously done by medical technicians or even by the doctors themselves. They save hundreds of hours. But there's no sense in which this automation makes doctors less valuable or less necessary. Arguably, it does just the opposite. It makes them better able to diagnose and therefore better able to treat and then therefore more useful. Right? So these technologies augment rather than automating the value of what doctors do. But you don't need an example of someone in the professions. Consider if you're a roofer. Having access to a pneumatic nail gun driven by an air compressor dramatically increases the amount you can accomplish in the day, the difficulty of the jobs you can do. It makes you more productive. It's a tool. It's not a substitute for labor. It's a complement to labor. If you're a designer, having access to computer-aided design software, drafting software allows you to focus on the creative aspects of design and then use the technology to eliminate or reduce the amount of repetitive drawing or slow, cumbersome calculation. It increases the value of what designers can do. Or if you're an educator, technology doesn't just allow you to do the same lecture for more people simultaneously, although it certainly does that, but hopefully it makes education more accessible, less expensive, and more engaging, more interesting. Those technologies used well increase the value added of educators. So in all these ways, technology doesn't just automate what we do, it augments what we do, it increases the value of the expertise that we possess. Now, finally, the final point I want to make about why there's so many jobs has to do with the invention of new work. And by new work, I mean work that requires expertise and specialization that wasn't previously needed. So what is new work? Let me give you some concrete examples. Let's say you're an accountant. There are some tasks that are timeless. All accountants need to learn the client's financial rules. They need to master the laws and so on. There are tasks that have been automated, now done by machines, organizing financial data, performing calculations, generating tables and figures. These are time-consuming activities now done super quickly by computers. But there's new work. So here are new job titles found in the US that were added between 1970 and the present in accounting. So a Burroughs bookkeeper, a computer bookkeeper, financial compliance examiner, a mortgage disclosure act specialist. These are all new areas of expert work that didn't exist, prior to 1970 and have been added much more recently. Give you another example. Again, you don't have to go to the professions. If you're a fitness trainer, there are timeless tasks like grunting and sweating, the agony and the ecstasy, as the Olympics used to say. There are tasks that are now done by machines, things that are automated, everything having to do with measurement, with equipment adjustment, resistance, weight. These are former person tasks now done automatically by new technologies. But there's also new work. These are new job titles represented in the United States. So sports psychologist was added in 2000, or sports nutritionist, or certified therapeutic recreation specialist in 2018. These are all examples of new work. So let me say some more about new work. How do we measure it? How much is there? And how does it relate to what I was talking about the role of automation versus augmentation? So what you're looking at here on the right-hand side of my screen is a document called the Alphabetical Index of Occupations by Industries and Socioeconomic Groups. And every decade, the US Census basically creates a catalog of all the titles that people write in on their census forms when they're asked, what do they do for a living? And this records in extraordinary detail the specific categories of work that people report themselves to do. So for example, in 1990, we have a single entry for a health technologist and technician, not elsewhere classified. This is what you would find in public use census data if you were to download them from the US government website. Under that are a list of about 200 specific detailed titles that people report that are classified to this occupation number 208. So for example, artificial limb fitters, brainwave technicians, extracorporeal circulation specialists, ocular care technicians, surgical brace makers. These are all detailed expert activities within this broad category of health technologists. And we can actually identify the addition of new specialties by comparing decade by decade, which things are added to this list. So, for example, here are some new job titles that were added to the Census Index of Occupations between 1940 and 2018. So in 1940, we saw an automatic welding machine operator. In 1960, a textile chemist, a controller of remotely piloted vehicles in 1980, in other words, a drone pilot, an AI specialist in 2000, or a pediatric vascular surgeon in 2018. These are all new things that people report themselves doing. And you can see they're all new expert work. They all require some specialized knowledge. Now, looking at this list, you might think, well, I see what new work is about. It's about, using new technology, fixing new technology, selling new technology, designing new technology. But let me give you another list. These are also from the same volumes and list other new activities that don't have a technological component. So a tattooer, or a mental health counselor, or a conference planner, or a sommelier, the person who sells you expensive wines at a restaurant, or a drama therapist. These don't reflect changing technologies per se, but changing incomes, changing tastes, and changing demographics, the aging of the population, for example. They're all something that appeared that it wasn't previously present. Now you say, well, what makes new work distinct from old work? What's different about it? Well, the answer is new specialization. So to be high paid, to be valuable in the market, a skill must be scarce, meaning not that many people have it, and employers want you to do it. It's valuable to them. So all the examples I gave, a welding machine operator, a mental health counselor, a tattooer, a sommelier, a drone pilot, these all require a certain amount of expertise that most people don't possess, at least for a while. That's what makes them valuable. That's why new work is important. It is the case that non-specialized work pays poorly, even when it's socially valuable, right? A waiter, a housekeeper, a daycare teacher, a home health aide, a crossing guard. Some of these are life and death activities, but they're all poorly paid in almost all countries. And the reason is that the skills to accomplish them are not scarce. Most people can be an effective crossing guard or security guard or daycare teacher, potentially, with minimal expert training, minimal educational investment, and that lack of specialization means they tend not to pay well. Okay, that's what new work is. How much is there? Does this matter? Well, so this figure shows you our best estimates of this. So in 1940, in the United States, we estimate that about 40 million workers were employed overall. In 2018, we estimate about 50 million workers were doing the job titles that were present in 1940. But the size of the US labor force has tripled in that time. In fact, there are about 140 million workers active in 2018, meaning that more than 60% of all employment in 2018 is in these new specialties that were not present in 1940. That's our best estimate. So there's a lot of it. There's a lot of new work. It suggests that new work is an important part of the overall evolution of work. And just to give you a simple example to sort of highlight this, right? In 1900, 40% of all US employment was in agriculture. Today, it's 1.5%, perhaps less. So you might think, oh my God, so much agricultural work has been eliminated. Work in the US must have gotten so much narrower because now people are crowded into the 40% of people who are doing agriculture are now crowded into everything else. But in fact, the opposite is true. There's so much new expertise in medicine, in technology, in services, in entertainment, in travel, so on, that in fact, work has gotten more varied. It's gotten more complex. It's become more expert. It's become more educated. It's certainly not getting narrower. And the reason, of course, is the invention of new work. Now, I had said earlier, technology is obviously involved. We know it automates away a lot of existing work. How does it augment work? How do we think about that, and how do we measure that? Well, we try to distinguish between technologies that augment, meaning they add value to workers' tasks and foster specialization, versus technologies that automate, that substitute for worker tasks and reduce worker scarcity. And so this is the somewhat slightly more technical part of the talk, geeky part of the talk, where I'll explain how we do this. So we want to try to distinguish those two types of technologies. So here's how we do that in a nutshell. The first thing is we use that same information source that I described before, the census index of occupations, and think of this as describing the outputs that work creates, right? The limb fitting, the extracorporeal circulation services, the industrial hygienics works. We think of these as describing the outputs of occupations. So this is our measure of things that the value created. We also use another set of documents called the Dictionary of Occupational Titles that describe the inputs that people accomplish in their work, right? So for example, the medical technician makes laboratory tests of urine, blood, animal parasites, infections, and animal inoculations, makes blood counts and smears, gives biological skin tests, prepares vaccines, etc. Right? So we think of technologies that do these things on the right as potentially automating the tasks that people supply. We think of technologies that reference these things on the left as potentially augmenting these services, the outputs that are created. And so we attempt to do that in data by essentially, won't go into detail here, but essentially we take all patents that are produced in the United States, or actually, excuse me, they're registered in the United States, they can be produced anywhere in the world, and we link them on the one hand to these measure of occupational outputs, these titles, and on the other hand, these measures of job tasks done by workers that reflect what people do. And we look for patents that essentially increase the value or the variety or the quality of these outputs. We think of those as patents that augment workers. Conversely, we think about patents that accomplish those worker inputs as automation patents. And we measure the exposure of each occupation simultaneously to both innovations that augment work and innovations that automate work. And just to give you a sense of what this looks like, here I've kind of done a scatter plot. On the horizontal axis is the exposure of occupations to automation. And on the vertical axis is the exposure of occupations to augmentation. So you can see many occupations are just sort of, equally exposed or not exposed to both. So if you're a childcare worker, not a lot of technology automating you, not a lot of technology augmenting you. If you're a power plant operator, you're exposed to a lot of automation and to a lot of things that augment you, that increase the value of your expertise. But now notice there's important sets of occupations that are exposed to a lot more than one or the other. So for example, if you're a machinist or an elevator installer or a cabinet and bench carpenter, those occupations are exposed to a lot of automation, but not so much augmentation. And so we're going to expect them to shrink over time. They're being eroded by innovation. Conversely, if you're an operation and systems researcher or analyst, right, you're not, you're exposed to a lot of things that augment the value of what you do, but not so much automation. And so we're going to tend to think the opposite occurs, that those occupations will grow over time. And in fact, we corroborate this. I'll show you one second. So just to give you a sense of how this connects to this notion of new work I was talking about, here I take all the major employment categories that you would find in an industrialized country, and these cover all the jobs there are. I look at the relationship between exposure to these augmentation patterns, these new innovations that potentially increase the value of labor, and the emergence of new job titles. And what you can see is looking across all of these categories and looking across over time, either 1940 to 1980 or 1990 to 2018, where we see new augmentation innovations being introduced, we see new demand for expertise, we see new job titles emerging. And so here, this is the flip side of automation. This is where we see new innovations that complement people, we see new work emerging. And just to give you one more quick picture of that, this shows you the relationship between, and I'm sorry, this is not adequately labeled. This is changes in employment within occupations between 1980 and 2018, so roughly the last 40 years. You can see that occupations that are exposed to a lot of these augmentation innovations, they tend to grow, holding automation constant. Conversely, holding augmentation constant, occupations exposed to a lot of automation tend to shrink over time. So what that suggests is that both of these technological forces are underway simultaneously. We shouldn't think the only effect of technology is simply to automate us. In many ways, it augments us. But some people are exposed, or some activities are exposed to more of one than the other. So it's not to say that it's all good. Don't worry, you get an equal amount of both. Simply that the relationship between the technological change that we're experiencing and the work that we're doing is constantly evolving. And new things are being created, but things are being replaced simultaneously. So now, what does that mean? Does that mean, well, since this process is underway, we see both automation, augmentation, we can just sort of relax and let it take care of itself? And the answer is no, we can't do that. So the good news is, as I underscored earlier, at least it's in the global north and industrialized countries, we're not running out of jobs. There's no evidence throughout North America, throughout Europe, and throughout in most of Asia that there's an excess supply of workers relative to jobs. In fact, in most of these countries, labor markets are very tight right now, and there's a kind of a demographic shortage of workers. So it's not that we're running out of jobs per se, but the bad news is that most workers in many industrial countries aren't benefiting very much from rising productivity. So for example, this figure shows you the relationship between overall productivity measured as output per hour of labor, average pay, meaning all the pay divided by the number of workers, and then median pay, meaning what the typical worker receives, where 50% of people earn more than that, 50% of people earn less than that. So you can see that from the end of the Second World War until the mid-1970s, these things rose rapidly and in lockstep. Productivity grew a couple percent per year, which was a lot, and median and average wages rose right along with productivity. But then after the 1970s, we saw this remarkable divergence. Productivity per hour continued to rise, not as fast as earlier, but still at a good clip. The average earnings rose less rapidly than productivity, meaning that labor's share of national income fell. And finally, the median rose barely at all. And we estimate it only rose by about 11% in 40 years. And so this growing gap here reflects inequality. The difference between the average and the median means that the distribution of earnings is becoming more skewed, so that it's possible for the average earner to earn more, even while the typical earner doesn't gain much, because so much of the pay is going to the top. And you can see that in this figure. This shows you the steep rise of earnings inequality by education group that has been characteristic of most of the industrialized North over the last 40 years. So the earnings of people with a graduate degree or with a college degree have risen a fair amount since 1980. Those with some college or a high school education, no college or no high school degree, have stagnated or in some cases fallen in real terms over the last 4 decades. And so this growing inequality helps to understand why we've seen this decline with no rise in the median, with a lot of rise at the top. Okay. In the interest of time, I'm going to just skip a couple slides and just say, well, what's gone wrong, right? It's not we run out of work, it's not we run out of new jobs, and yet we see these this growing gap between the average and between what the typical worker experiences and the overall trajectory of productivity growth in the economy. So I would say there are 3 forces that have been most important. One of them is technology itself. The digitalization of work has made highly educated workers more productive. It's augmented them a lot, and it's done a lot of automating of less educated workers. So that's the first factor. The technology itself has been an important contributor. A second is the way we have managed or mismanaged globalization. So, you will all be aware that China's rise as a global manufacturing trading power from kind of 1990 to the present has been a huge positive force overall for world welfare, right? It's brought hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty, but it's also created prosperity, resource booms in Central and South America. It's brought all kinds of investment into sub-Saharan Africa that was neglected by the West. So it's been overall an enormous force for growing world income and reducing global poverty. Simultaneously, it's placed a lot of downward pressure on manufacturing jobs and household incomes in manufacturing intensive communities in competitor nations, including the United States. And this has been handled poorly in terms of those benefits of lower prices have also meant less employment for some, and rich country governments have done little to insulate workers or compensate them for the losses, particularly in the United States. And this has led to a lot of frustration and fury and a lot of political backlash that we see, for example, in the election of President Trump in 2016. The third, and this is quite important, is really faltering and neglected labor market institutions. In the US, we see weakened labor unions, extremely low minimum wage by historical standards, and outdated employment regulations that have not been improved in 5 decades. They've not caught up with standards, and in fact, they in many ways have been eroded. So here's one way to illustrate this. This shows you the purchasing power adjusted hourly earnings of low education workers in 2015 across a variety of countries. So think of this as a person, working at McDonald's in the United States, are earning $10.33 an hour. Now compare them to someone doing similar work in Norway or Germany or Australia. They might be earning 75% more, 100% more per hour, doing very similar work. And even if you compare them to Canada, just across the border from the United States, that person would be earning about a third more. They would be working at a place called Tim Hortons instead of McDonald's, but it's very similar. These differences reflect differences in aggregate productivity across countries, but they also reflect institutional differences in inequality and what we tolerate and expect for people at the lower end of the education and employment spectrum. And this is not purely a market outcome. This reflects societal choices, societal priorities about what level of inequality we want to tolerate and what are the minimum requirements that we expect of employers in creating jobs. So the point I want to make there is it's not employment per se, at least in countries that are functioning relatively well and relatively productive, but there's a lot to be concerned about distribution. So let me finally talk about shaping the future of work. So what is the future of work? I like to point out that I don't think that's a good question, actually, because the future of work is not an act of looking into a crystal ball and predicting what's going to happen. It's much more about the future we want to create. In other words, the question about the future is not what will happen, but what are we going to make happen? What are we going to create? Let me just speak briefly on that before concluding. So I had the pleasure, as was mentioned earlier, of co-leading this MIT task force on the work of the future, along with my colleagues David Mindell and Elizabeth Reynolds. And we looked at 5 major technologies to think about what their labor market implications might be. So we looked at autonomous vehicles, industrial robotics, intelligent supply chains, additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence. And I can summarize our conclusions in a sentence. The momentous impacts of technological change are unfolding gradually. So these are momentous technologies. Although autonomous vehicles, kind of belly flop for a while, they were overpromised and underdelivered. They will change the future of driving over the next 20 years. There will be fewer people driving commercial vehicles relative to the amount of trips taken because they will be increasingly done by autonomous vehicles. Industrial robots are coming out of assembly lines and moving into restaurants, moving into retail, moving into healthcare. Intelligent supply chains, additive manufacturing, artificial intelligence being the biggie. These are all really important technologies, but they take a long time from invention to their actual consequences for the way that most people work. Why is that? Well, in many cases, they involve big changes to supporting institutions and huge investments for them to reach the scale in which they really matter. So autonomous vehicles, let's say tomorrow morning you read in the newspaper that Tesla had, finally perfected the autonomous self-driving vehicle. It never crashed, never made a mistake. And let's say you believed Elon Musk when he claimed this. Well, even if that vehicle were introduced tomorrow, it would take 20 years before most vehicles would be of that form. Why? Well, for one, we have a huge installed base of trucks and cars that we're not just going to scrap overnight. Two, in general, it's going to require changes in infrastructure and the changes in the way we work. And so we have time to take advantage of that technology while changing skills and institutions to make sure that most people benefit rather than having concentrated job loss, which might occur if we adopt it overnight. And it's true for almost all of these technologies. They're highly important. It's hard to overstate how much they matter, but we should not think that the world is changing or the workplace is changing nearly as fast as these things are invented, because they are, in many cases, just initial ideas and prototypes, not things that have really diffused. And that means there's an opportunity to shape them and to invest in people to make sure that we maximize the benefits and minimize the adverse consequences. Along with that point is we need to recognize that invention is not an autonomous activity that occurs on its own. It's shaped by incentives. It's shaped by the way what we prioritize and what we spend money on. Let me give you an example. The notion of telepresence. Telepresence means being physically one place and virtually another, as we are during this meeting. I give the example of the Slocum glider. It's an undersea exploration vehicle, and it's one of the early examples of telepresence because undersea exploration used to mean sending people down to the bottom of the sea in very small, cramped submarines in which they were at great peril, and to feel around and look around down there. Now we send robots down below with the eyes and direction above, and we telepresently place our senses at the bottom of the sea without placing ourselves at the bottom of the sea. But this idea is now very prevalent, not just in deep sea exploration, but in remotely piloted aircraft, for example, civilian drones, or even robotically assisted surgery. In a robotically assisted surgery, a surgeon might be in the room with the patient and yet telepresently operating because they're operating a robot. This same idea became much more prevalent during COVID. We moved to virtual meetings, online schoolrooms, telemedicine, working from home, right? Interestingly, what changed during COVID was not the technology, but our decisions about what was acceptable, what was normal, right? Zoom and things that we're using now had been around. They just hadn't been adopted. Most people wouldn't have considered them acceptable. So this choice of how to use the technology reflects economic incentives and collective decisions, not just what machines can do. And to give you like one specific example of that, we know that with COVID, many people doing work that was basically mental work as opposed to physical work could potentially do that work remotely, but most of them were not doing so. And many of them moved to home, working from home. And if you look at patents in the US patent database that mention working from home, right? It's about a 0.5 percentage point of all patents from January 2010 to January 2020. And then all of a sudden we see that double or more than double in the course of a few months. Why? Well, you have a lot of high paid people now working from home, and a lot of entrepreneurs think, wow, if I can create a technology that augments them, that makes them more productive, I can make a lot of money. And so we see in real time the shape of innovation changing according to the economic environment. It's not by accident. It's not magic. It is a response to incentives. So let me conclude about talking about shaping the future. There are many technological possibilities made available to us, especially through artificial intelligence, that allow us to change many things that we do and augment or automate. So for example, China has the best real-time content filtering system in the world. They can delete posts and images and statements as you post them. We also see the rise of the surveillance state, not just in China, where it's done by the government, but in the United States, where private sector firms do a huge amounts of surveilling of the population. Now, these are not intrinsic characteristics of the technology. There's nothing about artificial intelligence that says it must be used for content filtering or for monitoring people, but people have made enormous investments in that, right? China has made an enormous investment in monitoring its citizenry, and the US private sector corporations have made an enormous investment in monitoring consumers for the sake of selling advertising. But that's not a necessary result of the technology. We see the same technology used differently in other settings. For example, assisting with elder care or telepresence surgery or mobile medicine. This is a robot that lifts patients out of their beds in Japan. Japan is the world's oldest country in terms of average population, it's average age of the population, and desperately needs help with caring for the elderly. This is a good use of robotics for that. You could use the same technology to make workers more productive doing diagnosis, maintenance, repair by providing real-time information. You could use the same technology to enable immersive learning through augmented and virtual reality. The point being that most technologies, but especially artificial intelligence, create a vast set of problems we can solve, from some of the most pressing, like in climate change, poverty, malnutrition, lack of education, lack of access to healthcare, to some of the least valuable, for example, monitoring our citizens or filtering and censoring what they say. What we actually do with it is a collective choice. It's not a function of the technology itself. So let me conclude. The work of the future is something for people to shape. There's a palpable fear that innovation will foster inequality and erode opportunity, and that's a legitimate concern. Much of the last 4 decades in industrialized countries has seen that, growing productivity, and yet many people not benefiting. But that's not inevitable. Those results are institutional choices. They are not forced upon us by the technology. We build the institutions that turn productivity into shared prosperity or fail to do so. The majority of the work that we do today had yet to be invented a century ago. And so the job of the president is to build a future working environment, a future labor market that we want to inhabit and that we want our children to inherit. And so the burden, but also the opportunity, is with us to use that technology and our societal institutions to produce good results. Let me stop there, and I welcome your thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much, David, for that tour de force. You gave us an excellent history of work with respect to technology. You have made a solid case for the work of the future. Yes, indeed, to say the future of work, what is the future of work, is the wrong question. What we should ask ourselves is, what do we want to be the work of the future? And so the work of the future is for us to determine. I'm going to move on to bring our discussants, Professor Pragna Rugnani, who is head of sociology department at the University of Johannesburg. Her research interests include sociology of migration, labor studies, changing patterns of work, social networks, and community studies. She is currently doing some research around migration, identities, and transcontinental linkages. Professor Pragna Rugnani, can you dissect for us this presentation by David from MIT? Professor Rugnani, the moment is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Professor Mutambara, and good afternoon to all our presenters, to Professor Marawala and Professor Mutambara, for this warm invite. And it is indeed an honor to be present today as a discussant with such an esteemed panel of speakers. And thank you, Professor Otto, for such a thought-provoking and I think largely also provocative talk. Given the lack of time, I'm going to focus on 4 key points that talk back to the brief provided today. And parts of the brief that I want to highlight is actually, the points given is that technology is neither the problem nor the solution. Furthermore, it can be argued that high industrial productivity and strong labor markets can coexist. In the fourth IR, more and better jobs can be built if we create robust systems and institutions that leverage technological advancement and innovation while supporting workers through long cycles of technological disruption. And I just want to talk a little bit back to that. I am a sociologist presenting a global South perspective, and my talk will present a different side of the story about work for the future, of the future. I'm going to draw on some of the current research from my master's and doctoral students looking at how technology and the fourth IR is shaping and changing their world of work, and in turn, the future of work. They are doing exciting work around this topic on 4IR. What I also want to highlight is the importance of the lived experiences and how we need to approach the 4IR from different angles and disciplines in order to assess the impact it will have on the different lives, on the daily lives of individuals. To contextualize this discussion and just to give the different context from Professor Otto speaking about the global North, South African society is one of the most unequal in the world, with the triple oppressors of higher unemployment, poverty, and gender-based violence, affecting the disadvantaged and the vulnerable, the marginalized, tearing the country apart at its seams. Unemployment among South African women account for 36.8% in the second quarter of 2021. Graduate unemployment is a very contentious issue in South Africa. In 2020, the overall unemployment rate increased to 35.3%, with youth unemployment at a staggering 65.5%. And many of the mainstream literature actually details that youth are 3 times more likely to be unemployed. Maharaj, in his chapter in the book by Ngwane and Tswaeri, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, A Sociological Critique, says that 14% of the world's population does not have access to electricity, and more than 95% of those without electricity actually live in sub-Saharan and Asian countries. Given these wide carnivorous gaps, how do we transcend this digital divide and leapfrog into a future where everyone benefits from the so-called deliverance of this fourth IR, and as we talk about the work for the future? One of my master's students looks at rural women's usage of mobile phones in their entrepreneurial activity as a form of livelihood, given the high unemployment rate, especially amongst Black African women in rural areas. She explores this concept of digital literacy and how it supports their small businesses. Digital literacy requires an understanding of the different digital media forms that individuals use to communicate and engage with various aspects of their social life. So facing these high unemployment rates has led women to resort into entrepreneurial activities using their mobile phones, and there's a wide body of literature that looks at this. However, some of the research also shows that access and use of mobile phones can help ensure the success of micro enterprises, as David has indicated, of how women interact with potential customers. It's a crucial tool to build networks, expand the entrepreneurial ventures into new markets, and help to strengthen the relationship. So in this way, we can see how the phones are used to augment their business concerns. However, we must also look at the other side of the picture. Globally, there are 250 million fewer women than men online, and those who have access to online platforms tend to use it for less complicated tasks than men do. In sub-Saharan Africa, statistics show that 45% of women live in rural areas that lack access to digital technologies, and internet usage is below that of the average of men. A body of work by the Global Systems for Mobile Association in South Africa, GSMA, in their study found that 72% of the women do not have access to mobile phones. Only 8% of the women have access to internet in urban areas, while it's 12% in the rural areas. So for a woman trying to be an entrepreneur in a patriarchal society, access to a mobile phone may represent an essential source of independence and form of livelihood. And similarly, for women seeking assistance with GBV, gender-based violence, technology has become the source through which they're able to reach out for help. However, despite men having more access to internet for various purposes, women remain 7% less likely to own mobile phones. An Afrobarometer report in 2019 showed that women generally lag behind on indicators of digital access, ownership, and usage in Africa. And this gap is most widely observable in sub-Saharan Africa. In sub-Saharan Africa, women are 23% less likely than men to own a mobile phone, and implies that approximately 74 million women remain unconnected in the region. So in Africa, we need to consider these gender-related digital gaps, or what we talk about as digital inequality or the digital divide, are a result of the low levels of women's smart or phone ownership, lack of confidence, control over technology use, limited digital literacy levels, their large childcare responsibility, and social cultural restrictions in diverse societies. It is against this backdrop of cultural norms, social beliefs, and restrictions which intensify the barriers that tend to affect women disproportionately compared to men. It magnifies the levels of digital inequality that confound women's financial independence, networking opportunities, and access to information. Thus, there is a need for more education around this, especially in developing countries. How then do we build robust systems and institutions that leverage the technological advancements and innovation that we are talking about, and that are facing these kinds of challenges? On a continent, there are discussions about the feminization of poverty and how poverty wears this face of a woman. Will this not be the case of increasing inequality on a bigger scale, as we spoke about and talk about the employment polarization? How can we leverage the continent in a way that no one is left behind? So I pose the question, is technology the problem or the solution? Or as Otto says, how do we prevent this inequality from actually expounding? The view that FOSS-IR and its combination of technologies as a remedy or cure-all for all social crises needs a bigger, broader, more inclusive conversation and interrogation. The social ills of inequality, poverty, racism, xenophobia, and homophobia, so prominent across the continent, cannot be eradicated by advancing the games of capitalism and its incessant drive for profit at the expense of equality for everyone. Tsoaire and Ngwane and Tsoaire, in their book, The FOSS-IR, Fourth Industrial Revolution, A Sociological Critique, rightly argue that the COVID pandemic brought home the realities of how people, strangers, communities across the world assisted each other and cared for each other, and demonstrated Ubuntu, an Nguni word term meaning humanity, sometimes translated as I am because we are. And they said that this crucial aspect of humanity cannot be replaced by technology or robots. And they argue that, as long as social and economic injustices between classes and nations continue, this rise of the FOSS-IR cannot solve the problems of the world. Technology is not neutral. It is firmly embedded in the social political relations of society, and it is shared by those in power to enhance the dominance of the subjugated. In contrast, I want to just explain this point a little bit further. A master's graduate student of mine who graduated in the May 2022 round explored the experiences of banking employees and unionists in South Africa concerning digitization in the banking industry with the adoption of AI technologies. Obviously, the unprecedented adoption of AI has affected the way in which banking procedures are carried out and prompted the extensive retrenchment of banking staff. The national lockdown regulations hastened this adoption of these technologies. The findings suggest that while AI has had both positive and negative impacts, AI technologies has also transformed the banking industry, as we know, digitized structures, increased productivity, and allowed for customers to experience convenient banking. However, the other side shows that technologies have also had negative effects on the employees' well-being. There have been mass retrenchment. Many bank employees have to reskill, upskill, downskill. There's a conflict of interest between the banks and unions in terms of the well-being of its employees, such that it has silenced unions' voices over the negative consequences of implementing technological innovation in the banking industry. A 2017 McKinsey Global Institute report shows that downsizing, resizing, and staff retrenchments has gained momentum as a managerial strategy to cope with the application of AI in the banking industry, such that staff retrenchment affects organizational performance, as we know, because the workload is drastically increased. For example, the queuing period for customers is longer because a large number of them are waiting to be assisted by fewer employees. Staff retrenchments increases workload, but is not commensurate with the increase in wages. It also lowers the morale of remaining staff and affects their performance. The remaining employees are thus also psychologically affected. In 2019, one of the largest banks, one of the 4 largest banks in South Africa, Standard Bank, closed 91 branches due to the introduction of AI technologies. So I leave you with the question then, how do we build better jobs and create robust systems and institutions that leverage the technological advancements to the enhancement and betterment of humanity, while supporting workers through long cycles of this technological disruption that is already prevalent, whilst not sacrificing the humanity of the workers. Before I conclude, and I didn't have time to sort of elucidate on this particular point, but it's almost a challenge, not a challenge, but it responds to the challenge that Prof. Marwala raised earlier in his introduction to say, how do we educate our students differently? And we've just, myself and my co-author have just submitted a chapter titled Humanizing the Fourth IR, Graduate Employability and the Career Paths of Sociology Postgraduate Students at a South African higher education institution, where we show how sociology as a discipline begins to humanize the fourth IR by the active development of the cognitive and soft skills of the graduates to lead in a 4-hour workplace. So I'm going to pause there and thank you for this opportunity to be a discussant. Thank you, Prof. Mutambara.
Thank you so very much, Pragna, for that Global South perspective. David, I'll give you a chance to reflect on some of these views, but I'm going to go to our audience. We want to make sure we have participation from our audience. Sebastian and then Rodwell. Sebastian, can you come in? You can either ask a question very briefly or a comment very briefly. Sebastian, and then we'll go to Rodwell. Sebastian, you got the moment.
Okay, thanks very much for an eye-catching and an ear-stimulating presentation to Prof. Atu. My question is that he has spoken eloquently on how the artificial intelligence and the future of work is perpetuating inequalities between the so-called executives and the shop floor workers. So I wanted to hear his view on how artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution is perpetuating inequalities between the global west, the global east, and the global south. That is the difference between the growing inequalities in terms of trade between China, the west, against an ever being impoverished Africa. And to Prof. Mutambara and Prof. Marwala, I wanted to ask a perspective from you, whether you feel, what is your view on the current levels of investment that is being proffered by African government in response to the skilling and training of probably postgraduate students in the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Marwala, if you're there, I'll give you a chance at some point. I'm going to move on to Rodwell. If you want to speak, raise your hand. There's a hand function in Zoom, or you can put a note in the chat room. We'll call upon you if you want to speak. Anyone from the audience, please indicate your interest in speaking or commenting. Rodwell, can you come through?
All right, thank you very much, esteemed professors, for the eye-catching presentations. They are very, very helpful and thought-provoking, as the previous speaker has said. So my question is more of a thought in terms of what are the chances that this will all self-capitulate at some point, especially if we are talking about technological strides that are being made. We're talking about artificial intelligence, and the world is sort of becoming interconnected, or actually is already interconnected. Even those workers that are not dependent, or that seem not to be affected by technology, still have to go and apply technology at some point. For example, waitresses, waiters, they still have to go to an automated system somewhere. But what are the chances that all this will one day maybe collapse, maybe in some pandemic, some technological pandemic? We have seen some films inspired by artificial intelligence taking over and all things going haywire. Is there anyone who is thinking about about that, and are there any fail-safe measures that are being taken to ensure that this does not happen? And then maybe secondly, speaking to our African governments, I see a reluctance, especially in accepting technology. So is there a danger that Africa will be left behind? I mean, every time there's politics, every time there's elections, we see governments rushing to block sites, we see governments rushing to block websites and all that. Is there a danger that Africa will be left behind in this fourth industrial revolution? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodwell. Professor Kiyu, can you go through?
Hey, good evening. I had questions for Prof. Otto, although I think both of them are not your main kind of point of the presentation. I'm wondering, you gave 3 reasons for why we need more work. One of them being that people always want more things. And I'm wondering how much of the kind of demographic reasons could also be in play here. And that can be both actually from the demand and supply side. Because we were actually joking not too long ago about some works, I mean, are just not scalable. So certain things, I mean, even with the machines or whatever, you just can't do more and more, because at some point we were just asked to, whether we can take more students with the online, teaching and learning. And maybe also from the demand side, I mean, you're showing the picture of all the stuff that we have at home. But some of the things, I mean, those things are the assets. I mean, it's not consumable, but there are also things that actually we consume. I mean, we need to eat every day. It's not that we eat one day and we are done. But I think in this part, I'm wondering, what do you think? Because on one hand, the world population is still growing, but it's definitely, slowing down. But in some countries, I mean, the population is actually shrinking. And there has been also the talks about maybe we shouldn't, the whole kind of criticism about capitalism, that we maybe should consider not to consume so much, because at the end of the day, a lot of things we consume are really not necessary. I mean, maybe people won't be able to do that immediately or very quickly, but when this thing eventually take hold, I mean, when we do become more frugal or become more conscious of what we consume, I mean, how would that impact on how much work we need to put there to produce all that stuff? So that's question number 1. The second part I found interesting is about you were saying that the specialized jobs generally have higher pay, and the general job usually have lower pays. And, it's a question I really take it quite personally, but I think that there's a lot of discussions about journalists being really on the declines for quite a long while. But if I think about it, I can think of at least 3 reasons why journalists may be more in demand in the future. 1 being that AI is very specialized. 2 being that journalists are generally the one who can see the big picture. I mean, specialists can't do that. 3, I mean, in the past, there are more journalists, so the specialists will be more in demand. But in the future, I mean, now we have more specialists. Then again, the minority, the journalist becomes minority. So would that change the picture? I will be really interested to hear your view on it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. The audience will come back for another round. Professor Otto, can you respond to your discussant, to the floor, but very briefly, 2 minutes or so?
Sure. Okay, so there's so much that was said, and it's very helpful. I really appreciate the comments of Professor Raghunandan. And I think I agree with how she opened by saying that technology is neither the fundamental problem nor the fundamental solution. There's no part of my talk that should be read as the 4th IR will solve these problems. I do not think so. I think there are human problems. They're solvable, but the technology is not really the source of them, and it's certainly not going to autonomously fix them for us. And so the challenges are institutional, and the challenges that were brought up about poverty, about inequality, about racism, inequality among the sexes, and so on. These are long-standing human creations and distortions, and they can improve. We have improved on them over time in most of the world. And it's important to recognize that we are at the lowest point in global poverty in human history. The largest number and the largest fraction of people throughout the world are living, lives where they are not starving and subject to violence, disease, and death at a very early age. Now, there's enormous inequality and enormous improvements that are possible, but we should not think we are going backwards. We are not. But again, it's up to human institutions. Those improvements are not due to technology. They're due to democracy, to reductions in violence, to better governance, and to changes in norms. So that's the first point on Sebastian Mukanza's point about the global South, and the East and Northwest. I think we're in a period of very rapid realignments. Certainly, the China's rise and the development of a lot of middle-income countries has changed the nature of international relations and the nature of inequality. It's an irony that we're in a period of rapid declines in global inequality, even as we see rising inequality in many countries. And so I think the only thing we can be certain of is that the world order that we have seen since at least the end of the Second World War is changing quickly and is no longer stable and is not what we should expect in the future. I think the question, a question earlier is, will Africa be left behind? Africa, unfortunately, has been left behind in many ways in the past. Question is whether Africa can turn that around, right? And one of the both, and I realize it's kind of silly to say Africa when Africa has many, many countries, but that's how it was put earlier. So I'll just reuse that phrase. I think one of the critical thresholds that we're on is with China's massive investment in much of sub-Saharan Africa. How will that be used? Will countries be exploited? Will they use that technology to their benefit? Will they create indigenous education and industry? And I think it's a very, very challenging problem. So again, I think my point is the future is open. I don't think we're on the, going back to Rodwell Sabana's question, or also Professor KU's question, I don't think we're at approaching either an a technological or environmental collapse. I don't think the technology is what we have to fear per se. We have to fear one another. Certainly we could use the technology to destroy one another. Certainly we can use the technology to destroy the environment, but it's not that the machines will do that on their own. It's how we will use them. There could be a global consumption slowdown. That would obviously be better for the environment. I don't see it happening. I think people are insatiable. As wealth rises and even as technology improves, people will consume more, not less. The question is to make that consumption more sustainable. Much of the world is much less energy intensive, or at least in the developed world, than it used to be, despite rising consumption. And so all paths through to sustainability run through better use of technology, not through encouraging human restraint. We're just not very good at that. On the last question about generalists versus specialists, I think it's important to say what we mean by generalist versus specialization. I think of many, I don't use the word generalist as much as generic, meaning something that everybody knows. Most of the lowest paid jobs in most countries are ones that don't use specialized expertise, whether they are working in restaurants, cleaning security, doing physical labor, even looking after children. These are poorly paid work jobs because the supply of people who can do them is broad. And of course, there are also other institutional forces. I don't mean to say that's the only thing. Specialists are paid more because they can do something that others cannot. And that's what we see in the professions, in technical jobs and managerial jobs. So I do not, although of course, people within those jobs need to be broad-minded, not narrow. There's no tension between expertise and broad-mindedness. Knowing more doesn't make you narrower. It makes you able to solve harder problems. So I think there will be growing need for expertise, but of course, people who can use their expertise flexibly. And so I suspect that's where we agree. All right, let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Professor Pratbaragnani, any responses to what you have heard from the audiences?
No, I'm fine, thanks. I think most of the questions were directed to Professor Otto.
Okay, there was one directed to me and Professor Marwala. African governments are not putting enough money into high technology, into the fourth industrial revolution. The assumption is that this stuff is for China, it's for Japan, it's for America, it's for Europe, which is a mistake, because some of these technologies can actually provide an opportunity for Africa to leapfrog. And wireless telephony is a good example of that, where you move from no communication, no technology to wireless telecommunication. So it's important that African governments do invest in wireless technologies, but in particular here in high technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. Also in higher education, if we don't do so, we will produce graduates who are not employable. Today now in industry, it is what can you do? Show me what you can do. Skills and capabilities that are required by industry. So it's important that we change our curriculum, we change our tools, we change our platforms so that we produce graduates who are employable.
So thank you very much. I think you have covered the Africa question quite expertly. So I'm happy with that. I mean, there's this issue of stability of these systems. I actually think that the movies do actually take this issue of stability of these systems to another level. But otherwise, you could be rest assured that there are people who are studying how stable a neural network can be when it is deployed in a machine, for example, So I'm quite happy with that. Then there is I just needed to, to talk about some of the positive things that are happening in the African continent. For example, the Smart Africa Board, which is chaired by the president of Rwanda, is intended to basically take many of the African continents into the fourth industrial revolution age. And they're doing fantastic jobs. The IoT Center of Excellence for East Africa, which I'm the chairman of, based in Rwanda, is also doing fantastic job. The work that the Namibians and even in South Africa are doing is definitely world class. So it's a mixed bag. Do we need to invest more? Absolutely. Do we need to make the fourth industrial revolution into a big topic in the African Union? Absolutely. So thank you very much. I thank everybody for this very, very inspiring engagement.
On that dimension of Africa, let me emphasize this. We must think in terms of regions and not countries. South Africa is too small in economy for them to leverage the fourth industrial revolution effectively. Nigeria is too small. We need to think in terms of SADC. We need to think in terms of ECOWAS, in terms of the African continent, 1.4 billion Africans, $2.5 trillion GDP. These are the numbers that will make our adoption of technology more effective on the continent. The idea is to move away from the nation state and emphasize regional integration, political unity, and working together in SADC, in ECOWAS, and in the African continent. I'll go back to the panel. Any parting shots, Professor David Otto? And if there are any other comments from the floor, please, I can take you. But Professor Atta, can you come in?
This has been a great conversation, and I don't feel that I have I'm very humble in this setting. I do not feel I have the answers generally for Africa or for South Africa specifically. South Africa in particular has a really distinctive history and a very distinctive set of challenges having to do with being a very industrialized country with a very unequal education system and a terrible history of oppression. And it is, as Professor Raghunanan emphasized, the issue of employment and the unemployment rates of adults and even more so of youth is just a unbelievably problematic and difficult problem. And I do not, as said, I don't think technology is the problem per se, nor is it the solution. I think education, of course, is critical. Investment in people is critical. Of course, investment in the infrastructure, as Professor Matambare emphasized, mobile telephony actually is one of the areas where we've really seen a lot of benefits in the developing world, because it allows for decentralized access to information, for more secure banking, for communications. So there's good possibilities there. But I think this is a difficult and challenging time, and but also one of opportunity. And the one thing, when we're talking about artificial intelligence specifically, I think what AI does that is distinctive, and as Professor Marwala emphasized, things move very fast with artificial intelligence, and many things are feasible, some of them great and some of them terrible. And the unfortunate reality is that all of them, well, certainly the terrible ones will occur, and hopefully some of the good ones as well. And that's where we have influence, right? So certainly the use of technology for surveillance, the use of that technology for censorship, that's going to occur. It's too easy for governments and firms to do it, to prevent it from occurring. So I think that's a very unfortunate consequence. The question is, can we simultaneously use the technology for good things that we want, to improve education, to improve access to opportunity, to improve access to medical care, to change the way we create and distribute employment and create opportunity for people. So there is possibility there, and certainly we'll need this technology to solve our energy problems, to solve our environmental problems, to democratize healthcare and education. It's an opportunity that is there, but it's a governance and political and institutional challenge. And that's where I see the gravest challenge of all. And I hope we'll use it well. So thank you very much for inviting me to this conversation today. And I learned a lot from everything that was said, and from the many comments and questions. I hope my remarks were useful, understood, as they are really coming from a global North perspective, to give you what I see here, but not in any sense a diagnosis or a prescription for the challenges that are different and hard in different places.
Thank you very much, Professor. Before I go to Professor Pragna Ragnani, there was a question in the charts that says, is there a way to develop AI which complements human beings? Yes, there's what is called human augmentation, where you build machines, you build AI which works with human beings to produce better performance. In other words, man plus machine is better than machine on its own. It's called human augmentation, or human 2.0. There's also the issue of artificial general intelligence, where you're building machines that can do general intelligent things as opposed to specific and targeted intelligent activities. Of course, there are fears around issues of consciousness. Can you build a machine that has consciousness? Can you build a machine that has intentionality? And so on and so forth. Yes, those are genuine fears. And also the issue of super intelligence, a machine that is more intelligent than the most intelligent human being. Those are challenges that come with the field. Professor Pragna Ragnani, your parting shots.
Thanks, Professor, and thank you for this invitation to be really part of this very dynamic panel. And I agree with Prof. Otto that technology is not the problem, but it's about how we view technology, the fear of technology, and how do we eradicate that fear, and how do we change, and as Prof. Marwala says, reframe our conception of the future. And I think, by my main point is, one is about the role of capital in all of this, which maybe, is a point that needs to be highlighted, but perhaps, it needs further interrogation. Maybe it's not the correct forum at the moment to talk to this, but it's something that has immense impact on how technology is developed, used, how it affects countries. My main point, I think, is about how do we eradicate the inequality? How do we not leave people behind? How do we make it all inclusive, that everyone gets drawn into this reframing of the future that we are talking about? And I think that's the most important point, is that, we need to use technology to reduce the inequalities that are prevalent in society at the moment. And that's my main point. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We're now moving on to the closing remarks from Professor Fiona Tregena, who is research chair in industrial development and professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg. She's got a PhD from Cambridge and a master's from the University of Massachusetts.
Yeah, on behalf of the university, let me offer a vote of thanks to Professor Otto for really synthesizing such a significant and complex body of research, fundamental contributions to knowledge in a way that's accessible, engaging, and relevant, particularly to us here in South Africa. I think it's been not only of scientific interest, but directly relevant to policy and to people's lives. And I think particularly so in a country such as South Africa, which is in some ways a microcosm of some of the kinds of contradictions and challenges which you've alluded to in different contexts. Thinking through the kinds of labor market changes associated with automation, both in terms of net employment changes and compositional changes, including the polarization that you've spoken about, and the effects on welfare through those labor market changes, as well as the direct effects on welfare through technological progress. Discussion has already alluded to the high rate of unemployment in South Africa. And we can think about the fact that a low-skilled or semi-skilled worker who's displaced through technological change may never find a job again. They may never get either superior job that's created through technology or even a similar low-skilled job. And so how do we as a country then deal with employment creation and maximizing employment opportunities through technology, minimizing employment losses, and managing the welfare effects that flow from employment losses that do occur? And how do we reconcile these changes in the labor market with the broader imperative of technological upgrading, not falling further behind the technological frontier and so on, as a means to an end? Obviously not as an end in itself, but as a means to growth, to development, to welfare improvements and so on. So let me end with just underscoring what I think was perhaps one of the fundamental message of this evening's talk about taking the future in our own hands, I guess as a country, globally, and so on. And that's obviously contested. There will be different groups with different interests in what that future should be. So it's about agency, about choices, about power, to maximize the benefits in an equitable way, and think through who bears the losses. How do we socialize some of those losses so that they're not borne by the most vulnerable? So I think from this evening's talk, we've really had a global perspective on these issues that really resonate with us here in South Africa, and put a challenge to us as academics, and for those of us who are also involved with policy issues and so on, to make active choices now that will affect future outcomes. So let me end on that note, and again, thank Professor Otto for the stimulating and powerful talk, and hand back to the chairperson to close.
Now, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We continue with the search for knowledge. And tomorrow, we continue with a seminar on blockchain technologies, cryptocurrencies, and Bitcoin. So join us tomorrow, 5:30 p.m. for another interesting discussion, this time on blockchain technologies, cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin. But I want to thank you so very much for coming, and the struggle continues, the struggle for knowledge. I thank you so very much.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.